Good morning, folks. My name is Jimmy Bashar with the ISO Stakeholder Affairs Group. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the California ISO call to discuss the second revised draft tariff language for Phase 2 of the Hybrid Resources Initiative. I'm joined today here also by my colleagues, Andrew Ulmer from our Federal Regulatory and Markets Department, who will also be leading today's discussion, as well as Bill Weaver from our legal group, Amber Motley and Nick Sokol from our short-term forecasting group, Dave Murtaugh from our market and infrastructure policy group, also the lead for the policy development portion of this initiative, as you know, and Mike Turner from our model and contracts group. Our agenda for today, as with all tariff calls, will be to review the draft tariff language that we are proposing to file with FERC. We haven't received many comments aside from those from LSA, so we appreciate that input. So we've included those comments here today so that we can incorporate them as well as any other input that we hear during today's call. In addition, this call is recorded for stakeholder convenience, allowing anyone who is unable to attend to listen to it after the meeting. These recordings, as many know, are publicly available on the webpage for a limited time following the meeting, and we ask that the recordings and any related transcriptions should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. And lastly, if you have a question, we ask that you please raise your hand virtually by pressing #2 only if you dialed in separately. However, if you dialed in with your computer audio, we please request that you use the raise hand icon to ask a question. And when called upon for everybody, we please ask that you state your name and the company that you represent. And with that, I'll hand it over to Andrew.
Hi, good morning. This is Andrew Ulmer. I think I maybe want to start our call today and discussion with just a little bit of orientation to the landscape we're in. As perhaps most people joining the call know, we've had a stakeholder initiative underway for some time, since 2019, involving hybrid resources, which really extends to both hybrid resources and what we refer to as co-located resources. We've already proposed tariff rules governing hybrid resources and co-located resources, and have already started to refine those tariff rules. And what I think I would refer folks on the call to, maybe as a kind of an easy refresher of where we are and where we hope to be going, is an informational report we filed with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission in July of this year. FERC had requested that ISO's RTOs submit informational reports on market rules, as well as some other issues involving the development of hybrid resources. And it may be an easy reference for purposes of, again, refreshing what we've done so far, the current status of our market rules, where we're planning to go. The report was filed in July, I think on the 19th of July, in a docket, an informational docket with FERC AD 20-9, and the report's available on our website under our regulatory filings section. So with that, maybe I would sort of talk about what the scope of what we're proposing to explore today is, and it evolves from what we call Hybrid Resources Phase 2, which was an initiative we undertook in 2020 and resulted in us getting to a Board of Governors decision at the ISO to adopt a set of policies involving hybrid resources. We've coupled that with a refinement that was brought to our Board of Governors in the July timeframe that involves co-located resources and the use of what we refer to as the aggregate capability constraint by co-located resources at a single generating facility. our current tariff allows for the use of this aggregate capability constraint, which allows our market optimization to issue awards, issue dispatches in a manner that manages co-located resources output so that it doesn't exceed the generating facility's interconnection service capacity at the point of interconnection. What the Board of Governors authorized us to do was to extend that functionality to allow the use of multiple aggregate capability constraints at a single generating facility, so that co-located resources there could pair off with one another or aggregate with one another and be subject to this market optimization constraint. Anyway, that's the scope of what we're looking at, and I want to talk through, I think at a high level, the rules we're proposing to enhance, let's say, market participation by hybrid resources and also by co-located resources. And then again, I just went over the idea of extending the aggregate capability constraint, or I'd say expanding the aggregate capability constraint to allow for the use of multiple constraints at a single generating facility. So with that, I just offer that the rules we're looking at for hybrid resources really involve some relatively basic components. One involves our expectation of the responsibilities of scheduling coordinators for hybrid resources. It's a tariff rules that largely mirror rules we have for scheduling coordinators for other resources, the expectation that we would receive accurate information about the resource configuration, the expectation that we would receive meter data and telemetry data from these resources. The scope of that data would include something we're referring to as the high sustainable limit, which is really the instantaneous generating capability of a variable or intermittent component of a hybrid resource, and that's information that we're looking to obtain. Similarly, we're looking to obtain that same information from eligible intermittent resources, if you will, variable energy resources that have participating generator agreements with the ISO when they're co-located with other resources at a generating facility. We're looking for that high sustainable limit there as well. So apart from that rule, we also have rules involving bidding by scheduling coordinators for hybrid resources, and specifically the use of what we're referring to as dynamic bidding rules, or dynamic bidding limits. We're also clarifying certain resource adequacy rules for hybrid resources, and then we also are clarifying throughout the tariff not just our expectation of hybrid resources paying a fee for forecasting the production from their variable or intermittent component, but also adding some clarifications with respect to what information, site information, we would want from hybrid resources in Appendix Q of our tariff, which sets forth a number of information categories that would apply to eligible intermittent resources that use wind or solar, but also hybrid resources that have a wind or solar component. So that's the overall scope of the tariff language we wanted to discuss today. What I think Jimmy referenced was that we received one set of written comments and from the Large Scale Solar Association and the Solar Energy Industry Association. We thought it might be helpful to use that set of comments because it tracks through the language as a platform for discussion. One, because I think we should address them and make sure we understand the comments that were submitted, but we thought other stakeholders would also benefit from that. Before we embark on that effort, I'm wondering if anyone else on the call, perhaps Gabe, if he wants to come off mute, or others have anything they want to add with respect to where we are with this initiative.
I don't have anything to add beyond that at this time, Andrew.
Okay, great. All right. Well, I think what we'd like to do is go through the comments we received from LSA and SIA, and we can stop as we get to the comments, and I really want to make sure that we are taking the time to understand the perspectives they've shared, which we hope will be beneficial to other stakeholders on the call. And if it stirs a question from others, so be it, and we can capture that as well. So with that, Jimmy, maybe we can proceed forward and talk through the comments that we received. I think you're posting them on the WebEx, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. So let me know, Andrew, I guess what section you want to jump to. Right now I'm on page 2.
I think the first comment came up, and we may want to ask the submitter of these comments, so I believe it's Susan Schneider, who should be on the line, if she wants to unmute, because we may want to get her gloss on the comments that were submitted. And it'll help, I think, the dialogue. So, Susan, if you want to get in the line or get in the queue and raise your hand.
Hi, it looks like perhaps I've maybe already been unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yes, Susan, you are unmuted.
Oh, wonderful. Okay. All right. First of all, thank you very much for considering our comments. We did submit them late, so I apologize to all the rest of the stakeholders too for not having them out there in time for everyone else to really get a good look at them. But do appreciate the CAISO considering them and hope you'll find them helpful. I did want to ask one threshold question just from the very first page, and it comes up a little bit later as well. But you refer often in here to variable or intermittent, and I'm wondering if you are looking at a distinction between those two, and if you are, what that is, because when you get to Appendix Q, sometimes it's just variable, and does that include and it just I just was wondering if you could talk about that for a second.
Yeah, I don't think we're trying to draw any significant distinction between those two words. I think we're just referring to them in the common and the plain English meaning of variable and intermittent. Are you concerned that maybe there's a suggestion that there is a distinction between them, and maybe we should simply use one?
Why do you have both terms? How do you see them to be different? I mean, intermittent resource seems like it would be variable. I mean, if you're just in common English usage, but I'm just not understanding the use of it this way.
Yeah, that's a comment we can take back and look at that language. I'm not sure we're drawing a specific distinction between those two words in terms of the meaning of informing what kind of generating unit it is. Okay.
Anyway, back to the sort of the more general thing. Thanks very much for doing this, and we've offered the comments in the hopes of improving the tariff language and in the spirit of being constructive.
Great. Okay. Well, I'll note that first comment about the use of these two words and whether or not we can consolidate them. But I think, Jimmy, if you scroll down, I think the first comment we received was on section 27.13 that covers the aggregate capability constraint.
Yep.
Okay. And Susan, you have a couple of notes in the margin.
Yeah, I'm sorry, we're not seeing section 27.3 here. It's some other part of the comments.
Michelle, does the screen look okay? I'm showing 27.13, page 2 is what it's showing on my screen.
Yes, I also see 27.13 aggregate capability constraint. Is that the one you're talking about?
Perhaps if you scroll down, there's only the top of the page that looks visible.
Oh, Susan, if you see the right-hand side of the screen right there, right, there should be a scroll bar where you're able to maybe scroll down.
Oh, I see. Okay. All right. Oh, okay,
Yeah.
great. Never mind. Okay. I apologize. My own technical ignorance.
No. No worries.
All right. Well, just to start, I think at the outset of this section, Susan, you offered some language to try to clarify that the ISO would only enforce an aggregate capability constraint at the request of an interconnection customer.
Yes, and I think that is the case, and the way it's there's some language at the bottom that might be better at the top, but this basically starts out saying the ISO may enforce this. Well, why would they do that? Well, they would do that if somebody asked them to.
Okay. Yeah, I think we understand that comment. We'll definitely take a look at that and see if that's something we can incorporate. And you've added some language as well in the first sentence and highlighted that it's an important clarification that the ISO may enforce an aggregate capability constraint for generating facilities with co-located resources.
Right, and ACCs are only needed where you have resource IDs that are sharing POI capacity. So let's say you had a generating facility, even if it had more than one resource ID, but they were both hybrid resources. They would each have their own distinct piece of the POI capacity, and they would not need an aggregate capability constraint. There's not intended to be any sharing of the POI capacity between them or any optimization in the market that way.
Right. All right. I mean, I think it's clear the comments. So I think we can keep going. I think I understand it. I think we'll have to look at these and reflect whether they're necessary to make or not. I think this is existing language we have in our tariff.
Yes, which is unclear, so that's why we suggested it. So if you don't have to answer the questions now, we'll just try and explain it.
Yeah, no, that's something we can achieve. And like I said, if it triggers other questions from stakeholders, happy to field those as well. People should just feel free to get in queue and raise their hand.
Okay, then sort of moving. Do you want me to walk through them, or do you want to just?
Well, I think I understand that. Yeah, we can certainly go back and forth. But I think if I read the next comment, it involves I think a question about whether or not the ISO, if it's going to allow multiple aggregate capability constraints at a single generating facility, needs to configure them as, if you will, a master aggregate capability constraint that covers the whole facility and subordinate aggregate capability constraints that cover individual co-located resources within the facilities. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, if you've got the co-located resources covered through ACCs within a project, there really is no, there really doesn't seem to be any reason to have a master ACC. You just cover all of the let's say you have four resource IDs, a solar and a storage, and another solar and a storage. So there are two co-located 4 resource IDs, and you have 2 ACCs, one for each pair. There really isn't any particular usage or reason to have an ACC that covers the whole thing, because each ACC covers a discrete piece of the POI capacity, and they're not sharing it. So there's no particular reason to have some ACC that covers everything when you've already got all the capacity covered through what you're calling here subordinate ACCs, but through 2 different ACCs, you don't really need the master. At least we've never seen an explanation as to why you need that.
Okay. It's a fair comment, and we'll take that back. I think we've been over this to some degree, certainly internally, but the comment about getting a fair explanation is definitely something we'll include in our transmittal letter, so it's very clear as to why the ISO thinks it needs to have a master aggregate capability constraint that covers the generating facility and as well as a subordinate aggregate capability constraint. It really may hark back at the end of the day to how the optimization treats the two.
Right.
And by that, I mean what kind of priority the optimization extends to the master aggregate capability constraint versus the subordinate aggregate capability constraints. And I think we've been clear with stakeholders, at least initially, when we're going to promote this feature into production, we would give both the master aggregate capability constraint and the subordinate aggregate capability constraints the same priority in the optimization. But I think we plan to modify that next year, where the subordinate ACCs would have a lower priority in the optimization than the master aggregate capability constraint.
Well, and the question is, why do you need that master? And then what you just said sounds very concerning, and so I'm sure we'll have more discussions about that.
Okay. All right. That's helpful. Thank you.
And then the other change here, the reliability, is just that it got stuck in the middle of a paragraph that didn't have anything to do with it. And so you also have some mention of that lower down, or I don't remember if you put that in or we did, but if you go down below, just scroll, you'll see that we did add, it seemed in the wrong place here. So if you scroll down, you'll see that
structurally, I like your proposal, which is to break this out and make it clear in sort of a separate paragraph. I think that's something we can certainly look at.
And then the other point here was to make sure that, this sort of vague thing about, reliability reasons, which is what was in the language up above. We would really like to see this much more explicit here, that this is only something that happens after the CAISO runs out of bids, and we would really like to have this in the tariff language. You can play around with the language a little bit, but the idea that this is not something that is just some vague reliability thing, there's a specific time when it would be used, and we'd like that to be clear.
Okay. That's a comment I think that resonates, and we can certainly look at that and figure out how to restructure this tariff language to provide a little bit more specificity as to the relative prioritization of the aggregate capability constraints in the optimization.
Okay. Okay, and then excuse me, there's a couple of things in there that are just mainly the next couple of things are just tinkering, so I don't think we need to talk about that. Yeah. So but at the bottom of the page here, this is odd language, because it's the CAISO tariff is the entity that, or is the instrument that has the ACC in it, and so then somehow if there's a violation of the ACC limitations, and the customer doesn't comply, then the CAISO normally the CAISO will simply revoke the ability to use it. But here, for the EIM entity, instead of saying that it can't be used, you somehow have to ask the EIM balancing authority whether it revoke its approval. So somehow now there's an approval that has to come in from the balancing authority, and then that then has to be revoked. Or it just seemed a little convoluted, and it wasn't clear why the CAISO couldn't just say, well, this facility is not eligible because they violated the conditions for it.
Yeah, fair comment. I think we structured this tariff language in a manner that allows an interconnection customer to come to the ISO, and its role as a balancing authority area, and the ISO's role to interconnect resources to utilize an aggregate capability constraint. But in a parallel path, our thought was, well, this market optimization constraint could be made available to projects, resources in EIM entity balancing authority areas as well. But it is that EIM entity, that balancing authority function, that transmission provider function, if you will, that is the gatekeeper, so to speak, for that interconnection customer and that other BA. And so we thought it appropriate to make sure we structured this such that the EIM entity has a role in ensuring that the operation of the resource using an aggregate capability constraint remains reliable, remains safe.
Well,
and for that reason, it's structured in this manner.
Well, do they have to approve the application of the ACC in the first place for an EIM entity?
Yes, I believe so.
Okay, and then what if you're going to request them to revoke it? But what if they don't? They still get to do it?
We're not going to request whether they would revoke it. I think we would put the question to them about whether it will revoke its prior approval.
Whether the CAISO will revoke it or the EIM entity?
The EIM entity balancing authority.
So what if the EIM entity balancing authority doesn't revoke its prior approval? It just then the EIM entity still gets to keep doing it, right? I'm just asking a question to illustrate how a little weird this is.
Yeah, fair enough. I mean, that's right. I think what the mechanism here is a safety reliability check with the EIM entity. And if the EIM entity says, no, there's no need to revoke the use of the aggregate capability constraint by this resource, then they've done their reliability and safety check, is our expectation.
Okay. Well, since it's an ISO tariff that allows them to do it in the first, well, anyway, you understand our concern about different treatment of resources in different places, but that's the nature of this comment. So we can probably move on.
Okay. We'll take it back and think about it and reflect on it, see if there's something we can offer in terms of more clarity. Yeah.
Okay, that would be great. Thanks. Okay, then scrolling down to the next thing, this was a pseudo-tie resources. We've had a discussion about that. We still feel that you should change it here. If I know you're considering it in the Energy Storage Enhancements Initiative as well, but this is still our position. Obviously, we
understand.
We've discussed it before. No. Okay.
We understand.
Okay.
Can we pause briefly and see if any of the language that we promoted or the comments that LSA or CS submitted has raised any questions among stakeholders on the call involving the aggregate capability constraint?
Thanks, Andrew. I was going to actually kind of try to interject. Yeah, I do think we still have folks in the queue. Is that correct, Michelle?
Actually, we do not anymore, so I guess they took their mind. There's only Susan and one other person that had their... Oh, someone else did just raise their hand, Samaya. All right, I will unmute them. Caller, your line is unmuted. You may ask your question.
Hi, this is Salmia Sastry with PG&E. Can you hear me? I'm confused about whether I'm dialed or... Can you hear me?
This is Andrew. I can hear you. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so this is a basics question, and apologies. So you guys know this a lot better than I do. But can you differentiate for me the interconnection customer with what you guys were talking about in terms of the interconnection customer and what Susan was talking about having an allocation of the point of interconnection, and if you're allocated at the point of the point of interconnection, you don't need this aggregate capability constraint. What is the relationship between the interconnection customer and the participating generator and the scheduling coordinator? So this may be a basics question.
Yeah, no, that's okay. I'll let my colleagues amplify, who probably are better at this than I am, but effectively the interconnection customer is the entity that comes to us with a project seeking to interconnect that project to the ISO grid, and it perhaps represents an entire generating facility. They're the ones that sign an interconnection agreement, say a large generator interconnection agreement with the ISO, and often the PTO, that's where they're interconnecting, the participating transmission owner. So you might have a developer signing an interconnection agreement with the ISO and PG&E, for example. The project or the generating facility that's covered by that interconnection agreement might be comprised of several different resources. So they may be participating. There may be 2 or 3, if you will, resource IDs or more at that single generating facility that has an interconnection agreement, that has a participating generator agreement with the ISO. And those resource IDs may be represented by one, or they may be represented by multiple scheduling coordinators. And that scheduling coordinator is really the entity that the ISO interfaces for purposes of market participation. The submission of bids, the dispatch instructions we would deliver, settlements that we would engage in based on the market outcomes. So I don't know if that helps, or
yes,
if others want to amplify.
Okay. Would the interconnection customer be the party that's responsible for, as Susan put it, sort of subdividing the allocation for the point of interconnection?
Well, I'd say, there could be, the responsibility for that could lie in, in several different entities. But I would say from our perspective as the transmission provider, from the ISO's perspective, we would look to the interconnection customer. We would say, we deal with you. And, for purposes of managing this interconnection to the transmission system, we deal with you. So if there's a need to apportion or manage how that interconnection service capacity is allocated or operated among different entities at your generating facility, then that's fine. But again, from the ISO's perspective, we're dealing with you, the interconnection customer, and then we're going to let the interconnection customer manage that.
Okay, so you could have one interconnection customer with a bunch of different participating generators behind it who may be owned by different entities, but it's really the interconnection customer in this example that's responsible for the relationships with all those participating generators.
In the context of the use of this aggregate capability constraint, yes.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay. Okay. Other questions?
I do not see any. Oh, one question just came in. Let me unmute his line. All right, Drew, your line is unmuted. You may go ahead.
Hi, this is Drew with EDF Renewables. If you go back to the previous comment before you skip down here, you mentioned on that line, it mentions that you will potentially relax the ACC before relaxation of the power balance constraint. I wonder about this in response to a DC coupled system where relaxing that ACC may not be physically feasible for the resource to actually meet that potential cleared amount should that constraint get relaxed. And I wonder how that is considered and handled in this case.
Gabe, do you want to take a stab at that, or would you prefer I do?
It's actually kind of an interesting question, and I think it's something that, we had assumed and have been assuming that. Well, I think perhaps the right place to start is sort of thinking about the kinds of scenarios where we would relax and subordinate ACC, and typically we're thinking about doing this in situations where, I think abstracting a little bit, the market optimization, never wants to relax a constraint. And anytime it does relax a constraint, there's a penalty parameter associated with that, which makes the objective function that it's trying to minimize even larger. So when we're thinking about scenarios where the market could be considering relaxing a subordinate ACC, these would, I think in the discussions that we've had during the policy development phase of this project, is thinking about scenarios where a set of resources below one particular ACC cannot produce above a certain amount. So maybe there's a solar and a storage resource. The storage is able to produce at full capacity. Maybe it's close to the evening, so the solar is really not available. So there's not very much capacity there. And the aggregate generation is something less than the subordinate ACC. And then there needs to be another factor that some other set of resources behind another subordinate ACC at the same co-located facility could potentially produce above their subordinate ACC. And in those cases, then the market optimization, if it really needed energy, could potentially relax the first sub-ACC and supplement that energy with generation from resources behind the second sub-ACC. So in this particular case, even if you did have a DC-coupled system behind the first subordinate ACC, you still, that DC-coupled system would still only be able to produce up to that value below the subordinate ACC threshold. So there shouldn't really be an issue here of sort of backing down those resources.
Okay, so I guess I may have been a misunderstanding on my point. This relaxation can only happen at a top level ACC that has subordinate ACC limits.
Yes, correct. Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, that was my misunderstanding.
Okay. That's a much easier question. Yeah.
But again, the focus of relaxing the subordinate aggregate capability constraints at a single generating facility, the point of it, as I think Gabe was highlighting, is not to find ourselves in situations where, but for the enforcement of these constraints, we're stranding interconnection service capacity at a generating facility, and we're stranding megawatts that could otherwise be utilized to help meet a reliability need before we got to a power supply imbalance issue. So that we're not going to relax a subordinate aggregate capability constraint unless co-located resources subject to that constraint, can't utilize it. If they can utilize it, then there's no need to relax it. But if for whatever reason they're unable to, and there's additional operating capability behind another subordinate ACC at that same generating facility, and those megawatts can help avoid the need to relax the power balance constraint in our optimization, that's the trigger for when we'd be looking at the opportunity to rely on the optimization to relax those constraints, take advantage of the additional supply that could be available, but for enforcement of the subordinate ACCs. We don't see this happening often. I think we've tried to say that, but I think we feel it's necessary to build into the logic of this design.
Understood. Thank you for the explanation.
All right. Well, I think maybe we go forward. I think there's a large set of tariff language with relatively minimal changes that comes from Section 29 of our tariff, which really involves which involves the energy imbalance market. And what we've added language here to highlight is the participation by hybrid resources in the energy imbalance market, and our expectation that these resources will be providing the ISO with information similar to hybrid resources that are participating in our in the ISO's balancing authority area. So if you look at the language, it tracks very closely to language we have in our existing tariff for variable energy resources. Our expectation is that the treatment we extend to hybrid resources will parallel that of variable energy resources that participate as EIM participating resources. So that's an explanation at a high level of that language. But I think the next comment we received was in Section 30 involving hybrid resource bids.
Yeah, so this was basically, when you're talking about upper and lower economic limits, I think we sometimes throw that term around, but I'm not sure that it's really very well defined, and it would be very helpful if you could define what you mean by an economic limit. Okay. Is the price in the economic bid? Is it some other thing? It just wasn't really clear. It's not really clear when you get down to tariff language what that really means.
We'll look at that, take that back, and consider it. Gabe or Bill, I don't know if you have any thoughts you want to share on that right now.
Nothing for me at this time.
Okay. Okay.
All right, and then when you get down to the next comment, the resource forecast, this is, I think this was discussed a bit in the stakeholder process, but it wasn't really clear how if you've got if you're submitting economic bids in the market, which these resources probably will be doing, how they will be able to give a forecast. So it's one thing that the dynamic limit is this is all considered to be part of the dynamic limit, right? And not an actual resource forecast after, after scheduling or something like that, right? This is just part of that hybrid dynamic limit.
Yes. So the idea is that this is a bidding parameter, the dynamic limit, that scheduling coordinators will submit for hybrid resources that has a look ahead of what the expectation is based on 5-minute granularity of the resource's capability. I think our expectation here is that the capability is that dynamic limit is going to be based on the actual operating capability of the unit. So to the extent that the hybrid is comprised of, say, a storage component, the storage component state of charge is going to inform that hybrid dynamic limit. To the extent there's a component of the hybrid resource that is a wind generator or a solar generator, that the production forecast of that component is going to inform the hybrid dynamic limit.
Okay, so you want that to be based on the forecast and not on the capacity that's installed or something like that.
Yes, no, right. It's very much an operating capability as opposed to an installed capability. And I would say, we did receive, I think, a friendly email from our colleagues in the Market Monitor who suggested some changes to this language that we're going to look at as well. And very, just to be concise and clear about it, it was extended to the sort of the use of hybrid dynamic limits for managing on-site charging. And that's something we're going to clarify in our language, that is permissible. And that might effectively, hopefully, answer your next question. The idea being that if you're using your dynamic limit to inform the market optimization of the operating capability of the unit based on, say, the state of charge, the resource forecast, or on-site charging needs of the hybrid resource, then there's no need to duplicate that with submitting an outage or say a D rate, if you will, in our outage management system.
Well, and then I think that did raise the other question, though. If you're trying not to, the dynamic limit obviously reflects both the resource forecast, but the resource forecast reflects the capacity that's available. For which, are you still supposed to submit an outage for capacity that's not available, or do you just reflect the unavailability through the forecast in the hybrid dynamic limit? And if you do both, are you not double counting? It was a little confusing.
Yeah. Okay. That's a fair question. Let us take that back and see if we can, provide some clarity there.
Okay.
Because if you actually do have a resource outage, you need to reduce the capacity.
Yeah, or a D rate,
Right.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Because it seems like they'd be in both places, and you don't want the system to think it's done twice. So yeah. Okay. All right. That was the nature of that question. Okay. Let's. I guess
our changes in the next sections really involve just making clear that hybrid resources will be subject to our market power mitigation processes.
Right, and we didn't have any comments on that.
Okay. We have language in Section 34 that really just parallels existing language we have for eligible emitting resources in terms of real-time market participation by hybrid resources. So I don't think there's anything that's too earth-shattering here. It should be relatively straightforward in terms of our expectation of how hybrid resources will participate in the real-time market. And then in the following sections, we're clarifying that hybrid resources, the capacity from hybrid resources that is counted as resource adequacy will be exempt from our resource adequacy availability incentive mechanism, similar to variable energy resources. This is a matter we discussed in our initiative that went to the ISO governing board last year, in the fourth quarter. I think the next comment had to do with counting for hybrid resources for effective flexible capacity.
Yeah, this issue actually came up in the stakeholder process. We had submitted comments about this, and it somehow the position is still here, and this is really a big issue. This is on item G, and the issue here is that storage normally counts for, and there was some uncertainty, I think, on the CAISO side when we had this discussion about how that works, but storage actually counts for the positive. If it's being counted for a flexible capacity, it counts for the positive and the negative side, so it's basically twice the NQC. And so if you put this restriction that if you mix it, just because you mix it with some other resource in a hybrid resource, somehow you've cut off half of the flexible capacity value of it, that's a huge problem. And I think the CAISO wants to use that and will use that flexible capacity in an operating sense. So I think there's no particular reason why the EFC should be cut in half just because it's part of a hybrid resource.
Yeah. Okay. So in part, as I understand the comment, is why the pivot from treating hybrid resources that are effectively non-generator resources differently from an energy storage resource that can utilize its entire positive and negative range to offer.
Yeah. I mean, the question is why does the storage element somehow lose half of its EFC just because it's coupled with something else? We certainly didn't. It was unresolved in the discussion. This was part of our comments, and we still believe this. And if you have a justification for it, that would be fine. But we haven't really heard one yet.
Yeah, no, it's a helpful comment. I think we'll take it back. We'll see if we can either eliminate this language or clarify it.
Okay, great.
So before we proceed into the appendices, maybe we want to just check to see if there are any other questions or comments triggered by the discussion so far.
Yeah. Thanks, Andrew. Perfect. Thanks, Susan, as well. I do see we have a couple on the queue. And before we go to the queue, Michelle, I do see a written question from Michael Volpe from PG&E asking a question on the high sustainable limit. If a solar resource is co-located with another solar plus storage project, which entity must provide the HSL data to the CAISO? Only the solar plus storage project, or also the initial solar resource? It's both, and if anyone else wants to chime in from ISO to elaborate, please feel free. So thanks for the question, Michael. And Michelle, I think we do have a couple callers in the queue.
Yes.
Okay, so you answered it, Jimmy, right?
Yes.
Okay, that's right. So both the co-located EIR and the hybrid resource need to provide the high sustainable limit.
Are we ready to move to the questions in the queue?
Yes, please, Michelle. Thanks.
All right, perfect. All right, caller, your line is unmuted. You may go ahead.
Hi, this is Chris Steven. Can you hear me?
Hi, Chris. Yes.
Great. Yeah, Chris Steven from Customized Energy Solutions. I had a couple comments on some prior sections here. One, just a housekeeping item up on page 2 of the overall draft tariff language in the section 4.18. Right at the top of page 2, there's a sentence that starts hybrid resources, a variable or intermittent component. I think you missed out a with there, perhaps hybrid resources with a variable or intermittent component. So just minor typo suggestion there.
Yes.
And I can email you that if you need that one.
Nope.
Got it. Perfect. Okay. Thanks for that. And then the actual substantive question I have is related to section 34.1.6.3 for hybrid resources on page 8 of the overall document. And specifically in regards to the section in the first sentence that says the CAISO will use reasonable efforts to issue real-time market schedules that observe hybrid resources, dynamic limits, et cetera, et cetera. So what I'm trying to get at here is to try to understand the phrase included here, use reasonable efforts, because I'm not quite sure what that means, and it may be just benign, but I just wanted to ensure that I understood it and what the intent was here because of a couple of things, and maybe I'll explain it, and then you guys could explain your thinking. But I'm wondering if this, is it actually going to be a parameter that's used in the software? Because going back to that section 30.5.6.1 that you mentioned earlier about the upper and lower economic limits, I was thinking, is that actually in the software as opposed to just limiting the amount of bids that go into the market? And is there any actual likelihood that there would be a market award that doesn't reflect the dynamic limits here because of the fact that you include the term use reasonable efforts? Because it was my understanding that it should really always limit it based off of that upper and lower economic limit in the actual optimization software. So hopefully that's clear. And apologies for the dog barking here.
That's all right.
Maybe let's capitalize reasonable efforts.
Right. It makes us want to answer your question. I think the way you characterize the phrase reasonable efforts as benign is probably the right way to characterize it. Certainly, these inputs into the market optimization are going to be what guide the awards, dispatch instructions that resources receive, but there are a number of different inputs and a number of moving parts. So having the state of charge telemetry, the production forecasts, the high sustainable limit, we'd be getting via telemetry and making sure that we're respecting the dynamic limits that are submitted as a bidding parameter. I think the phrase here is really, yes, the idea is the optimization is going to take all that in, and we'll recognize them. I think the language here is really simply an effort to explain that we'll do everything we can to do that. To the extent that something goes awry and you get a real-time market schedule that somehow is not entirely consistent with all the various inputs, I think we wanted to just make it clear that there's an expectation that that's how the optimization will work, but not necessarily a requirement that that's how the optimization is going to work in each and every interval all the time. But yes, certainly the purpose of setting all these structures up is to observe the hybrid resources operating capabilities in the optimization to make sure that we aren't giving the resource infeasible schedules. Though our optimization from time to time, not just for hybrid resources, for all kinds of resources, will issue infeasible schedules, and those schedules, get addressed generally through operator intervention.
Got it. Okay. Thanks, Andrew. That makes sense. I think it gives me a little bit more comfort. I was just a little bit worried that there might be something else going on here. I just wanted to confirm that stuff would be actually in the software as you explained it is. So that all makes sense to me, and I feel more comfortable now. I just wanted to make sure, that perhaps if this is seen or observed, that this happens a lot where they're getting these, potential infeasible dispatches, that maybe gets dealt with later at some point. But I think that's something to maybe observe. Yeah. So fair enough. Okay. That's all I had. Thank you.
Okay, good. And we calmed the barking dog for now.
Yes. He's happy now. Thank you.
All right. We are moving to the next caller in the queue. Caller, your line is unmuted. You may go ahead.
Hello, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Hey, a little bit if you want to, I don't know if you're far away from your mic or not, but I can hear you.
Is this better?
Yeah, Andrew, can you hear
I hear somebody. Yeah.
Yeah, this is Alva. I'm trying my computer.
Yeah.
Hey, can you hear me now? Sufficiently?
Yeah.
You sound.
I can. So just 2 points on the previous discussion. One of the major differences between the dynamic limits and the other pieces of information that are being input here is that the dynamic limits are input by the market participant. And so it's clear one of the use cases you'd be concerned about would be where the market participant put in limits that were not feasible to all of the other information. And that can be done unilaterally by the market participant. So I think it's a very valid concern, not just from the perspective of the ISO business as usual, but that you have to have the language here to address the possibility that market participants may enter, to put it in the most generous terms, their dynamic limits in a particular interval.
Yeah, certainly a possibility. It's a good observation.
Yeah. The other point I wanted to make was on the EFC discussion with Susan, that it seems to me that the charging range of the battery should only be counted towards EFC if the resource is submitting with a negative P-min. And there's been a lot of discussion about hybrids potentially being in the master file with 0 P-min so that they can't charge from the grid. So I just wanted to raise that as an issue that would need to be addressed in order to allow for that. I think if there was a negative P-min, then that range should be part of the EFC. But if a hybrid was presented with a 0 P-min, then the fact that the battery could charge should not be part of its dynamic range, the dynamic range of the resource.
Well, I think if a resource is being counted for flexible capacity, then it is actually required to submit bids for the full positive and negative value. So I think what you're saying, I think makes sense, but I think that is actually part of being counted for flexible capacity, isn't it? For that for storage.
Well, I think the resource could be defined with a P-min that was 0 in the case of a resource that was going to be charging exclusively from the solar. That's been discussed before. I agree with what you're saying, and I think that's the way it should be implemented. So thank you, Susan. I appreciate that.
Okay. Sorry, I didn't mean to jump in for the ISO on that.
Thank you.
No, it's okay. All right, there aren't further callers. Maybe we can push on.
There are no additional questions in the queue.
Okay.
All right, thanks, Andrew. I'm on the appendix if you want to start on that now.
Okay. Appendix F is really just clarifying language with respect to the forecast fee that we charge for eligible intermittent resources. We're making it clear that that extends also to variable energy resources that are EIM participating resources. That's the case today. And that it would extend to hybrid resources as well with a variable component. And noting Susan's comment earlier about the reference to variable and intermittent, we can look at whether it's necessary to change or to include both those words. The Appendix K changes. Appendix K are certification requirements for ancillary services, and our expectation is that hybrid resources may offer ancillary services, and we just wanted to essentially reinforce in these sections that a component of that is for us to receive the resource's high sustainable limit through telemetry. resources providing AS or ancillary services in our markets are subject to telemetry requirements. We would already have the requirement for EIRs that are co-located or hybrid resources to provide us with a high sustainable limit, but we want to extend language in Appendix K to clarify that if an eligible intermittent resource or a hybrid resource is offering AS, be it regulation, spending reserve, or non-spending reserve, that they'll be providing us with that high sustainable limit every 12 seconds as well. That's an important piece of information to understand the operating capability of the unit. And if the unit is carrying some kind of capacity that we're counting for regulation purposes or counting for contingency reserves, we need to know it's there. So.
Well, but they already have to provide the high sustainable limit, so you're repeating that here. And then the 12-second thing, I don't recall, and I apologize if I missed it, where that was ever discussed in the stakeholder process. Is it just that we need them to provide it more frequently if they're doing ancillary services, or is that for everyone? It just wasn't 100% clear how that's supposed to work.
Yeah, fair enough. We are repeating some of the language above here. Maybe it's a belt and suspenders approach. The 12-second telemetry requirement really comes from, I think we get a technical paper on the high sustainable limit that should be posted in the stakeholder initiative page. There, I think we actually said 10 seconds, but the reality is that we're doing the telemetry on a 4-second interval. So instead of dropping that to 8, we thought it more appropriate to raise it to 12.
And that's whether or not they're providing ancillary services, or only if they are?
That's whether or not. That's the telemetry requirement we would want to understand for these resource types.
Okay.
Okay, and then we get to Appendix Q, which is the protocol we developed for eligible intermittent resources, which we want to extend, actually did extend to hybrid resources in a filing we made last year, but wanted to provide greater clarity and more detail with respect to the information requirements we expect. And so there's some of the language in Appendix Q that we've presented is new. Some of it is really clarification of existing practices and a bit of a reformatting of how we presented these information requirements. So you can go through the comments if that makes sense.
Yeah, here you've got variable and intermittent, and then you've got wind and solar, and then sometimes you just have intermittent, and then sometimes it's everywhere else you've used the term variable or intermittent, and here you've got wind and solar specifically. Although this is called eligible intermittent resources, not eligible wind and solar resources. So anyway, the term it would be nice, and helpful if you could sort of stick to the same. Pick one and go with it. You know what I mean?
It's a fair comment. The protocol in Appendix K of our tariff will really, before we extended it to hybrid resources, really only sets forth information requirements for solar and wind resources. So it doesn't set forth information requirements for other types of variable or intermittent resources, just those two. And effectively, what we've done by extending it to hybrid resources is really only extended it to hybrid resources with a solar or an energy, a solar or a wind component.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we asked many years ago why you call this intermittent resources instead of wind and solar, and the answer was, well, we're trying to be technology neutral because there could be other kinds of intermittent resources that might also, whatever. And it's true that there's only wind and solar requirements, but anyway, it's again.
And that rationale holds. I mean, it's true potentially in the future. Maybe we would add new information requirements for different types of variable intermittent resources to this protocol, but for now, as you said, it's simply solar and wind. So, but we'll take a look at that and see if we can maybe make the language conform, because I think practically it doesn't make a difference if we say variable and variable component if the information requirements only extend to wind and solar. So.
Right. Okay. And I agree. Practically, that's pretty much what you have. So. You can skip through the rest of the ones we had that said ditto on them.
Okay. Well, it's helpful to see the ditto because it'll help us track it. So I appreciate it. There is a comment I think you have about forecast fee.
Let's see.
But the intent here is that the forecast fee would be per megawatt hour of generation.
Just for the generation, but not for the storage discharge.
That is the intent.
Okay, it might be good to clarify that.
Yeah.
I think that's probably obvious, but because you're not forecasting discharge, but since that's sometimes where the solar energy goes, it might be good to clarify that.
I think the next comment you had was in section 3.1.1.4.
Yes.
And it was
Go ahead. Sorry.
It's, I think, a question about.
Well, yeah, it talks about there's some clarification that solar projects are allowed to share basically metadata. And wind resources, and I'm not sure how this normally works, but wind resources, if there's a sharing agreement where the data could be the topology is the nearby project, the topology is the same, it's maybe an adjacent project, it's on the same land, whatever. It seems like there shouldn't be any particular reason why they could not use some kind of sharing agreement. And this really did not appear to, I don't recall that this was discussed in the stakeholder process at all.
Yeah, I think this is largely a clarification of what I understand is an existing practice in terms of how we treat wind generators.
Well, why would you do that different from solar?
I don't know if Amber or Nick Sokol are still on the line or not, if they want to offer anything.
I mean, I can see situations where you can argue the data is not similar for wind or solar. If you're having a sharing arrangement, you should at least have to demonstrate that the data actually work for the sharing, from the sharing arrangement. But to just simply prohibit it, no matter how representative it might be, it does seem somewhat unfair. And
yeah, I think
differential treatment is not explained.
Yeah, I think the idea is that the resource itself has to have its own meteorological data, and so if you have a separate resource ID, it has to have its own separate meteorological data, and that our practice has been to adhere to that. So this is trying to make clear that existing practice, but we will take the comment back and have a discussion with our forecasting team.
Well, and the differential treatment between wind and solar is not why that would be. I mean, obviously we don't want you to go and say prohibit both of them, but it does seem like in either case, if you can show that the data are representative, it should work. And there's not ever been, as I know, at least in this initiative, a discussion of this at all and why you would treat one different from the other.
Okay, we'll take that back. That's helpful. Thank you. Okay. You have a comment on the table below.
Yeah, I mean, this is sort of getting into the weeds a little bit. The idea that you've got wind resources. I mean, the co-located resources are treated as separate resource IDs, and you've already got elsewhere places that say, well, if you're a wind resource, you have to you have to do it. And wind resources are not part of co-located resources; they are a co-located resource, but there are already requirements that say you have to do whatever, you're a wind resource ID, you have to do what wind resource IDs do. So it just wasn't anyway, it just wasn't clear why you would have to single that out here.
Okay, well, let us take that comment back, and we will go through Appendix Q again with these comments in mind and see if we can either clarify or reduce the amount of text and data fields that we're asking for.
Okay. The next comment on the hybrid resources or the megawatt values through telemetry. I think that's also, isn't it also, I guess you can provide it separate for the wind generation. That's different from other resources. But the overall resource, all resources have to provide megawatt values through telemetry, right? So there's no reason to list that separately.
It's a clarification is all.
Right. Oh, okay. All right. So it's the same as other resources.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Maybe say that. And then we've already talked about the 12 seconds. We can skip over that, I think. And then just getting on to
yes,
the list of yeah. Go ahead.
We might add some language to say, to the extent applicable or something along those lines.
Well, that's always questionable because then you go, well, to what extent is it applicable? That's not very helpful.
Right. But the hybrid resource will know the verb resource ID is not applicable. So we could even perhaps clarify that with each data field here. If there are any that are inapplicable to a hybrid resource, we can call that out.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
Okay. All right, and then. For plant location, I'm not going to worry about the plant location there. And I'm scrolling down, so.
I think we actually have a couple of questions. That was a good time to pause.
Yeah.
Okay.
Michelle, you can feel free to open the.
Sure, I can unmute the question. All right, caller, your line is unmuted. You may go ahead.
Hi, this is Sonia from PG&E, and we're engaged, obviously. Yeah, you can hear me okay?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay. So I have 3 questions, which are related to the high sustainable limit, and also going back to that example that my colleague brought up on a co-located resource with one, say, hybrid facility and then a different solar facility behind it, with their different participating generators, possibly different project owners. Is the CAISO's expectation then that the second solar facility that is not hybrid or co-located, well, it is co-located, but it doesn't have the storage component, that it provide the high sustainable limit? Just to clarify, it is. And so how would you go about enforcing that?
Well, our expectation is we'd have telemetry on the resource, and that telemetry point, that data point, would be provided to the ISO.
Okay, so it's
in
not.
Many cases,
but
in
it's
many
something
cases
that
it might be.
Would have to have a telemetry point to see that it's provided.
Right, it would be telemetry point.
Sorry, I'm not sure if I heard that.
I said yes, it would be a telemetry point.
Okay, and it's an additional point. It's not something that's part of what's provided now. It's something that the generator would have to enact.
I believe that's correct. Does anyone else on the ISO team who may want to offer any thoughts whether or not there's an existing telemetry point that could substitute for the high sustainable limit? I don't believe so.
Yeah, this is Dick Sokol. I don't think there is either.
Okay. Okay, I think that's interesting to see how that works out. The second question was, with that same example, say if I may be confused about this, say if that hybrid resource decides to provide ancillary services, does that normally a solar resource can generate as capable unless there's a specific CAISO instruction to follow the DOT? would there, because this other resource behind that point of interconnection is providing ancillary services, would there be any expectation of the standalone solar resource on following the deal?
Not sure I heard all of that.
Yeah, this is it. I think the expectation would be that, you know, if the independent solar resource was bumping up against the upper limit of what it could produce or what the aggregate capability constraint or the POI for the resource was, then, you know, the ISO could issue a dispatch instruction that the resource would have to follow, and it would not be allowed to produce as capable. But generating under those limits, under, you know, typical operation, yes, the resource would still be allowed to produce as capable.
Okay, cool. Okay, thank you. And then finally, I know this is beyond the tariff, so I appreciate your patience with these questions. I read something, and I think I was a little bit confused about the application of the high sustainable limit. Is the Tyson envisioning with UCAP that the high sustainable limit would impact a facility's UCAP? But if this is not the right time to talk about that, totally, we can punt.
I think the frank answer is yes. The intention is that the UCAP language would include values from the high sustainable limit. That policy has not been written yet, and it's still being worked out through resource adequacy enhancements. So there'll be a lot more discussion in that policy on that piece of it.
Okay. Thank you.
All right, we are moving to the next question in queue. Caller, your line is unmuted. You may go ahead.
Hi, thanks. It's Chris Devin from Customized Energy Solutions again. I had a comment or question on the Appendix K ancillary services section regarding hybrid resources. Specifically, I guess my first question would be, is it correct that CAISO is certifying hybrid resources for ancillary services only based upon the storage component amounts of installed capacity in those hybrid resources?
I'll need to take that question back. I'm not so sure. One, that we have many, if any, hybrid resources that have certified to provide ancillary services as of this date. I need to confirm that. And then exactly what amount of capacity is being certified. That would be probably something that the scheduling coordinator would bring to us in a certification test, and we would review, and it'd perhaps be some back and forth, but I have to check. I don't know if we have some kind of parameter like that we're enforcing at this point. So we'll have to get back in touch with you.
Okay. My understanding is that that is what is happening right now, according to clients that we have that have told us that. So I'm not able to discuss that in detail, but that's what my understanding is. So I guess I wanted to bring it up here just because it seemed like it was a good opportunity to talk about it. It's really not clear to me how, like, maybe a wind and a solar could be combined, and then maybe those could provide ancillary services, or even just, you know, individual wind or solar resources that aren't hybrid resources providing AS, you know, and that whole issue, I think, is not really very clearly laid out. But you know, setting that aside, I guess I just would wonder if, you know, if there was anything in the actual policy proposal that was approved by the board that would limit that. It didn't appear that was anywhere in there to me. And so I guess, you know, if that is the case that's going on, it really should be documented somehow or discussed in the stakeholder process. I just wanted to raise this here because it seemed like a good opportunity to mention it. Perhaps it's something you guys should consider in, like, the future, you know, stakeholder initiatives that you're running, but I guess kind of in the interim between now and then, it could be an issue for some, you know, providers that want
I
to
defer to
provide
Gabe
ancillary services.
about whether we included it in anything like that in our policy papers. I don't recall offhand. Certainly, if you think of the most simple configuration of a hybrid resource that's comprised of a solar component and a battery component, the scheduling coordinator might say, well, I only want to certify capacity that is reflective of my energy storage capabilities because I feel certain about that, but I feel less certain about what I can deliver from my solar component. So, but it's a fair point. We'll take it back and we can get back in touch offline.
Okay, yeah, let's talk about it offline. I think that would be good, but I would just put a finer point on it to say it's not about the scheduling coordinator saying what they're certain about. It's what the CAISO is saying we're okay about. And if it is just the CAISO saying we're only okay with having the storage providing the AS and not the wind or solar, then that should be documented more clearly. Perhaps that's the point I want to make. Yeah. I'll leave it at that. I think.
Okay. Our tariff is drafted such that if they're technically capable hybrid resources and wind and solar resources can all offer ancillary services.
Yeah, that's really that's exactly why I'm raising this, is because it seems like the tariff allows it, but from anecdotal experience, from what I've been told, it seems like CAISO may not be allowing that as according to the certification process. That's from what I've heard, but I think maybe some follow-up on that would be good. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks, Dennis.
Okay. Other questions?
There are currently no additional questions in queue.
Just to return to Appendix Q, I think, Susan, maybe you did have an additional comment about our proposal to...
Oh, yeah, the shapefile submission
yes.
requirement. I don't recall that was ever discussed, or, the need for it was ever discussed, or why you need it, or anything like that. So it seemed like an addition that somebody thought would be nice to do, but really wasn't part of the stakeholder process.
Yeah, fair comment. I mean, I think we're looking at Appendix Q and thinking through the amount of information we're getting and the format we're getting it in. And this, I think, effectively is a clarification that we're looking to include in this filing, and the need to get shapefiles, need to get information in a format that is functionally usable. My understanding that it's very challenging to get information in the format we're getting it today. And I don't know if Nick remains on the line or not. If he is, I welcome any comments from him. But that's the thrust of the request.
Yeah, I don't.
Proposal.
Yeah.
I can offer more on it and its use. Really, what the shapefile is, its intention is to provide geographic information. So when we receive the topo map, it's basically unparsable by a computer. With the shapefile, we're able to take that data and we're able to do validation on the information that's provided during the registration process, which would basically expedite the registration process for the submitter. Because instead of us having to review manually that information between the site sheet and the topo map, the shapefile could serve as an extra validator of that information and allow us to quickly process it. So shapefile is a pretty easy format to develop and produce, and overall it provides more benefits in terms of the customer who's submitting the resource for a forecast to be developed, as opposed to not having it.
Is it common software or that most people would have, or is it? I mean, I'm not a software expert or anything, but I don't think I've ever heard of it.
Yeah, so there's free ArcMap software, which is the paid option, but then there's also QGIS, which is freely available. And I mean, it varies depending on organization or institution that's running these. It's a pretty common modern format to use for geographic information.
Okay. As a practice, it would be good if the CAISO could avoid putting in tariff language things that were not discussed in the stakeholder process, because it sounds like this might have been a pretty easy thing to get through, but adding things at the end because you think they're good ideas, which I'm not saying it's not, but it would just be good to just make that a common make it a practice not to put things in tariff language that hadn't been discussed. So,
Yeah.
okay. Well, thanks for the explanation. I do appreciate it.
Okay.
Okay.
I think the remainder of the comments, I think, echo the earlier comments you had with respect to wind.
Yeah, wind, and then the question of the sharing of the data. You know, again, it is possible for solar, but not for wind. And I think most of the rest of this is just generally that's more of the same.
Okay.
So thanks for the ability to participate this way.
No, it's very helpful. Actually, it's helpful for us too. I mean, I know we're kind of in a time crunch in terms of reviewing this and thinking through it. But
can I ask one more question though about process?
Sure.
Would it be possible for the parts that have to do with the multiple ACCs when you make the filing to ask for expedited treatment? I know we brought this up during the stakeholder process, but we already have resources that are coming online now that are already some of them online that really, really need to use this. And so it would be great if it was possible to get expedited treatment for that.
Okay, we'll note that.
Thank you.
And in terms of process, we do some work, I think, to synthesize these comments with the tariff language. So we'll be doing that, and obviously working toward submitting the tariff filing to FERC as soon as possible. But we do want to make sure we've gone through these comments and done our best to reflect them in the tariff where we can. And I'm time permitting, I'm optimistic we'll be able to hopefully get you some responses to those elements that we either incorporate or those elements that we don't and why we don't. Maybe just ask if there are any additional questions before we conclude.
I don't see any questions here unless you see something, Michelle.
I do not see anything. I'm looking in both queues. Nope, I do not see any questions at this time.
Great.
Well, maybe we'll get to work and return 30 minutes to everybody's schedule for the day.
Do you have any idea when the filing might happen?
It's a question I expected soon, but we're still in the process of obviously, refining and the language itself, and we'll be moving as rapidly as we can. So I don't have a date for you yet, Susan.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks again, Susan, and for everyone's comments. And as Susan mentioned, good input for the stakeholder process. This is all new territory, folks, so we appreciate you working with us throughout the entire initiative process to get this done. So thanks again, Andrew, and for everyone for joining. And as mentioned, this was recorded, so you can look for that to be available soon. And as Andrew mentioned, you have an extra 30 minutes, so hope everyone has a great rest of your day.